Well, it's great to be back here. It's been, I think, 8 years since I was here, something like that. And it's wonderful to come into the conference, and I'm very sorry that I couldn't make the first 3 days. I would have lots to say about that, all of that material, but I think we have time to talk about all of this later. So I have a very general and abstract kind of a talk to give today, with a very simple kind of an organization. That's de Kooning, by the way, and right behind him, that's Greenberg, and there's Noguchi. Very simple organization here. I'm going to concentrate on 6 sets of unresolved problems in art criticism. I'm going to skip this sentence in red. I sadly had to cut a number of slides out of this. I'm going to skip this, but I want to mention that in the fuller version of this talk, I have material on the idea that art criticism could be non-verbal, that art criticism can happen by pictures and images, that visual art can be criticism. Something that I think is very important, but I have to skip it for today. And then I'm going to talk about several recent attempts to figure out art criticism, to say what it is. I'm going to talk about the famous October magazine roundtable on art criticism from 2003 or whatever it was. And then again, because of lack of time, I'm going to skip a very interesting thing that if you don't know, I recommend you go and look it up. This is the Columbia Arts Journalism Survey. It's the only quantitative survey of art criticism that's ever been made. Unfortunately, it's only for the United States, but it lists all of the top critics in the United States and tells how much money they make and what artists they like and don't like. It's very entertaining. But I am going to talk about the book State of Art Criticism, which was a book that I edited, and it's another attempt to figure out art criticism. The reason that I skipped these 2 things in red is to make room for this. I put this in last night. I saw from the program of this conference, especially the first day, that a fair amount of the subject matter had to do with art history. And because most of my work these days is world and global art history, I want to put in a section here about possible parallels between ways that art criticism is theorized and ways that art history is theorized around the world. So that will be the last section of the talk. Okay, so the first theme here, 6 sets of unresolved problems in art criticism. And that's the little book that got me started on this subject, little polemic book that I wrote. In the background of some of these slides, I have pictures that are not related to what I'm saying, just because I think that if you don't show pictures, it gets very boring. So that's Ouija. Has nothing to do with what this. So first of the six sets of unresolved problems is that art criticism is very widely discussed, but as we all know, there's no central text for art criticism, no common starting place, no working definition for art criticism. Everyone talks about art criticism, for example, here and at these other organizations. And also in the United States, people who work in the United States hate these 2 organizations, AICA and NASAD, because these are the ones that accredit art schools, and they're always talking about art criticism. And then there are many institutions around the world that offer courses in art criticism, so art criticism gets taught a fair amount. And how many of you know about this, DBAE, Discipline-Based Arts Education? Does anyone know about this? Right, so this was once upon a time, about 10 years ago. This was the Getty Institute. It was an attempt to completely rethink the way art is taught around the world by dividing it into 4 disciplines, and art criticism was one of them. So briefly, there was a lot of Getty money that was put into the idea of art criticism. This has mostly disappeared from the West, but last year in China, someone told me that there's an official government initiative to adopt DBAE in Chinese universities, so maybe it's still coming. And then, of course, there are journals that offer articles on art criticism. So everyone talks about it, but there is no central source for it. I'm going to show a couple of screens of very, very commonly read definitions of art criticism, just to make the point that nobody knows what art criticism is. So this is from Wikipedia. And as you know, you can go back in time in the internet using archive.org. You can find the past history of internet pages. So if you go to archive.org and look at October 2005 for art criticism, the definition for art criticism, this is what you get. So I'm quoting from Wikipedia, 2005. Art criticism is the study and evaluation of art. This criticism usually involves the use of aesthetics or the philosophy of beauty, although there are other techniques. Now, I think this is a very funny sentence because aesthetics is the philosophy of beauty. The philosophy of beauty is aesthetics. And what are these other techniques? No one knows. Part of the purpose of art criticism is to have a rational basis for the appreciation of art and avoid subjective opinions of taste. But this is not always achieved. I was like, you know. So then Wikipedia keeps evolving, and I have 3 more quotations. As of October 2007, this is what it said: art criticism is the written discussion or evaluation of visual art, much more serious now, written. Art critics usually criticize art in the context of aesthetics or the theory of beauty. One of criticism's goals is the pursuit of a rational basis for art appreciation. And then comes this paragraph. Though critiques of art may have lasted as long as art itself, art criticism as a genre refers to a systematic study of art performed by scholars and dedicated students of art and art theory. I think this was written by a PhD student in a university art history department because it's very serious and scholarly. It doesn't sound like it was written by an art critic. So from about 2008 to 2010, this is what Wikipedia said. It started the same way, and then it had this. The most common division in the field of criticism is between historical criticism and evaluation, a form of history, and contemporary criticism of work by living artists. In other words, to divide art history from criticism and not let them talk to each other. Where did that come from? I don't know. Another art historian, I think. And then there's this passage, a little bit off the subject. Despite perceptions that art criticism is a much lower risk activity than making art, opinions of current art are always liable to drastic corrections with the passage of time. I love the last bit of that, liable to drastic corrections, so that you know, the poor art critic out there making mistakes gets corrected by time. Okay, and then this is the way that Wikipedia is now. Art criticism is the discussion and evaluation of visual art. Art critics usually criticize art in the context of aesthetics or the theory of beauty. One of criticism's goals is the pursuit of a rational basis for art appreciation. The variety of artistic movements has resulted in a division of art criticism into different disciplines. And this is just the division in the field, this is what I like, is between historical criticism and evaluation, a form of art history, and contemporary criticism. So it's kind of building a fence or a wall between art criticism, and which is probably wrong and not worth doing and not very dangerous, and art history, which is probably right and will last forever and is very scholarly. So one of you should go on Wikipedia and write the next version of this so that they have a better definition. My second example of a definition of art criticism is from the Oxford Dictionary of Art, which was originally called the Grove Dictionary. So I think probably you all know this is online, but it's also a 36-volume encyclopedia of art. It's the largest encyclopedia of art ever written. It was originally written by 7,600 art historians. So I was asked to write the entry on art criticism, and there it is. If you go online, this is what you see. This is the chapter on art criticism in the Oxford Dictionary of Art. And I just wanted to tell a little story about this. So when I was writing this, I wrote the first draft, and I said, in some theories, art criticism, art history is all about evaluation, that art history also judges. This is one of the ideas about art history. So I said, if you believe this, that art history is all about judging, then all 36 volumes of this encyclopedia of art are art criticism. So I sent that draft in, and the editor sent it back to me with that sentence crossed out. Because 7,600 art historians had contributed. They didn't want to be called art critics. And I said, you have to keep the sentence in because I'm not claiming this is true. What I'm saying is that if you believe art history has to do with judgment, then all 36 volumes are art criticism. So she said, yes, you're right, we'll keep it in. But if you go online, it's not there. It's censored. Okay, second of the reasons why art criticism has these unresolved issues, that there's no agreement about whether or not art criticism has a history. So in one way of looking at it, art criticism definitely has a history, and here are some of the people. These are all people whose names show up in courses in universities and academies on the history of art criticism. So if you look at it this way, then yes, art criticism, of course, has a history. All these people belong to the history. But there's another way of looking at it. You can say that art criticism has no history. First of all, because art criticism depends on judgment. And your judgment is your own. It's your own subjective, intimate, immediate, unmediated reaction to a work of art. And so historical precedents for what you're saying don't matter. If you think of it that way, then art criticism does not have a history. And then also, contemporary art critics, all of us, we don't write like Diderot. And we don't write like Baudelaire. In fact, we don't write like Greenberg. So in that sense also, art criticism doesn't have a history. Or if it has a history, the history is broken. And the history doesn't lead directly and continuously up to the present. If you compare that to art history, it's very different. Because art historians have other art historians that they're models. They model their work on them. And that's a continuous history, more or less. So for these two reasons, it's a reasonable thing to claim that art criticism is a very special field that doesn't have a history. But that, of course, raises the question of whether or not it makes sense to teach students about Baudelaire and Diderot. Were they doing something completely different, or were they doing something that leads up to the present in art criticism? That's Michael Kimmelman in the middle, the chief art critic of the New York Times, Daniel Barenboim on the right, Edward Said on the left. So, the third of these reasons is that many different kinds of writing get called art criticism. And I give you a little list. That's Arthur Dove's collage called The Critic. So here are some kinds of writing that get called art criticism. First of all, philosophic writing. Adorno gets called an art critic. He's writing art criticism. And Danto, obviously. And then there's also writing in quote-unquote serious journals, whatever those are. October, Fries, Texte zur Kunst, and whatever counts as serious. And then third, there's newspaper journalism, gets called art criticism. Exhibition catalogs, some people like me like to call our exhibition catalogs art criticism, although that's very contentious. I'll come back to that. Maybe even gallery brochures, I also like to call those art criticism. The point here is that this list is very miscellaneous. So the kinds of writing that get called art criticism are very much debated. It's not clear what gets counted as art criticism. And notice again that visual art is usually not on this list, even though visual art, an artist's work, is a form of criticism when it responds to a previous artist. Baudelaire, always very cheery looking. The fourth theme, that there's no agreement about what art criticism does. What's the purpose of art criticism? What does it accomplish? So here are some things that people say art criticism does. That's Jasper John's piece called The Critic Smiles. So first theory about art criticism, about what it does, is that it is art history, quote, in the trenches. That's an expression invented by Peter Plagins, the North American art critic, and he thinks that art critics are people who go out on the front lines in the avant-garde, literally, out before any art historian, and they're the first ones to encounter the work, so it's art history in the trenches. In other words, it's not art history yet, but it might become art history. Second idea about what art criticism does is that it judges good and bad art, and that would be historically the most common definition, that it's about judging and saying what is good and bad. Third, a lot of people say that art criticism just brings people news. In the Columbia Arts Journalism report, the one that I'm skipping for today, the most common answer that North American critics gave when they were asked, what does art criticism do, is brings people news. In other words, it doesn't judge. It's not about judging, it's about informing people. The difference between 2 and 3 is huge, because if you believe in the second one, then your purpose in life is to judge. And if you believe in the third one, your purpose in life is to basically let people see for themselves, not to judge. And people also say that art criticism is for educating the public, and we'll hear later on today, and you have been hearing about social and political purposes of art criticism. That would belong here as well. And then a surprisingly large number of critics in that Columbia Arts Journalism survey say that the purpose of art criticism is to entertain. Personally, I think that's very depressing, but that's what people say. There's Diderot. Fifth of these themes is that art criticism has no secure place in education. And I'll show you what I mean. That's Jasper John's piece called The Critic Sees. So the question here is, where is art criticism taught? What is the place of art criticism in education? And I give you a little list of places. First of all, it's taught in art schools and art academies in an ad hoc fashion. What I mean by ad hoc is that the typical thing that an art academy does, or an art school, or an art department, is they hire the most famous local critic who's willing to teach. And that person comes in and teaches students in her style of criticism. So it's very ad hoc. You get a different education in art criticism in different institutions because the critics tend to teach students to write the way they write. Art criticism is also taught in university journalism departments. That is journalism that also includes arts journalism, but it's basically about journalism. It's taught in university art history departments, but in university art history departments, art criticism appears as history. And by that I mean that if you study, for example, Baudelaire, the reason you're studying Baudelaire in a university art criticism class is because you're interested in 19th century French painting. You're not studying Baudelaire in order to be an art critic. So it's taught as history. And I have a little asterisk there. I think that it's true that there's no university art history no university art history department that systematically teaches art criticism as a practical discipline in order to educate students to become critics. But it teaches, art history teaches art criticism as history. And then fourth, it's taught in university departments as literature, as fiction. For example, Baudelaire is taught, obviously, as a poet. So art criticism also comes in literature, comparative literature departments as a form of poetry, as a form of literature. And then last and most interesting and most complicated to me is that art criticism is also taught in university literature departments as scholarship. And by that I mean that there is this discipline since the 1960s called in English literary criticism, which is basically the business of people in literature departments. And they imagine what they're doing to be a mixture of something that is like an objective history and a critical engagement. Post-structuralism has taught us all that. So that people like Derrida and Adorno are taught as models of criticism, and people who write on, say, fiction and poetry in literature departments understand art criticism as another form of critical activity like what they do. I have another asterisk there. So in this sense, all scholarship can be understood as criticism, as in the English expression, literary criticism. If you ask someone in a literature department what criticism means in the title literary critic, you'll get, and the people won't be so happy to answer that because they don't like to say, I am a critic. But the expression literary criticism is the name for the activity of scholarship in the humanities. So what should count as serious critical writing? It's very difficult to know in this respect, and I'll give you just one example. This was a conference that I was at in Bogota in 2008, and the notion in part of this conference was to revive art criticism for Columbia by reviving the essay. And since then, since 2008, I've heard of a number of different initiatives to try to fix or revive or rejuvenate art criticism by turning to the essay. One of the problems with this is that no one knows what an essay is. That's Adorno. So at that particular conference in Bogota, they had a list of things that they were recommending people read. Here are some of them. This is a very miscellaneous list. And from this, I really don't think you could get a coherent idea of what an essay is. This person, Lopate, is obviously completely different from Adorno. He's a North American literary person. So the idea of reviving the essay is, if anything, more confused than the idea of art criticism. Okay, sixth and last of these is that there's no good account of the difference between art criticism, art critiques, and critique. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is a book that I wrote for art students about art critiques. And from it, I'm going to take a little chapter. I have a little chapter in this book for art students to try to explain to art students what is the difference between critique, criticality, criticism, and the art critique, and so on. So some of the terms involved here, the Kantian critique. The Kantian critique in German, of course, means something very specific. It's a philosophic enterprise that's intended to see what is possible in any given critical philosophic context. It's different from what now gets called critical theory, which would include people like Foucault, Freud, Benjamin, the Frankfurt School. And that's different again from what gets called criticality. As criticality is something which, in my experience, entire conferences debate and end up with no clear idea. But criticality means something like artwork that's reflective and oppositional with respect to constructions of power. Criticality is not easy to define, but because it's a kind of moving target, it seems very promising to a number of people as a way to define what criticism is. And then there's criticism, which is the subject of this talk. And then there are the art critiques, called often crits in English. These have almost no literature on them at all, but they borrow from these other sources. And I'll show you one more screen of these terms that are used to define criticism, criticality, the critique, and the art critique. There's reflexivity. So critique or criticism are often said to have to do with reflexivity. The historian Rosalind Krauss doesn't like the word reflexivity because she says that that's a word that is just about a simple biological capacity that many mammals have of being aware of themselves. It's nothing to be proud of. But what you should be proud of is reflectivity, according to Rosalind Krauss, which is the capacity to think about the assumptions that you're working with. And that would maybe be a definition of art criticism or of the capacity to write interesting art criticism. And then there's Innerlichkeit, famous and often debated German term, which means something like a nonverbal sense of your capacity for introspection, your capacity for inward feelings, and so on. So you could see these are entangled, these three. I like a little book by Hans Belting on this subject, by the way, called The Germans and Their Art, A Troublesome Relationship. Fabulous little book. And then there's intuition, which is the commonest answer in surveys to the question, what do artists know? What do artists know that ordinary people don't know? Well, they have intuition. Right? So something like intuition is also part of art criticism. Okay. So I'm going to give you just one example of this. It's, of course, all these terms that we could talk about forever, but just give you one example. There was a conference at Parsons in New York in 2010, which you can get video for, called What is Critique? The conference had 2 sessions, morning and afternoon. The morning session was about the art critique, the thing I'm interested in, what art students have to do. And I was on a panel with a painter and a sculptor, I think. And then there was a lunch break. And then after lunch, they brought on a very high-power panel of Adorno experts. Lydia Gurr, Jay Bernstein, Greg Horvis, Chris Catrone. They're all Adorno experts. So the afternoon was all about critical theory, Frankfurt School critical theory. And the idea of the conference was that art critiques are a kind of unconscious, low-level Frankfurt School criticism. And if art students only knew a little bit better, they would realize that they're actually doing Adorno. But the two halves of this conference were never connected because the Adorno scholars are not interested in talking to art students. So there was no connection between art criticism, the art critique, and critical theory. To me, this is a very significant example of a huge gulf between the way that BFA or BA or MFA or MA artists are educated, a big gulf between that and what people in universities like to think of as critical theory, a big gap. That's a student in Iran, in an art critique in Tehran. So in this book, Art Critiques, a Guide, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what art critiques actually are. And I have, for example, a list of words that are ways you fail in art, things that your teachers tell you when you failed. Your work is impersonal, careless, makeshift, thoughtless. And that list is actually 4 pages long. These are some of the things that I've heard in art critiques as negative judgments. I like these ones. Kitsch, not close enough to kitsch. Its only thrill is how close it can get to kitsch. not kitschy enough, right, and so on. And the very last word I put is interesting, which of course is the most interesting word about how to fail. But my favorite on the whole list is this one, phaco-psychotic. I like that one. So this is just by way of saying that the art critique is a big terra incognita. Another example of a black hole of discourse would be art critiques as they are taught in art schools to artists. So the problem is not that the study of art critiques is unsystematic, and the problem is not that art critiques are disconnected from serious study of criticism and critique. The problem is basically that no one studies art critiques at all. Okay, so I finished this first with a top 10 list of reasons to talk about what art criticism is. Number 10, reason to talk about art criticism, no one knows how to define it. Number 9, it's practiced worldwide, but it's very little read. That is to say, all the exhibition brochures and things, there are way too many for any of us to read. Number 8, it has a variable influence on the art market, something that you've been discussing, that we will continue discussing. People think it's broken. People are always saying art criticism is in crisis, it's in trouble. You don't always know what art criticism is when you see it. You're not always sure when you're looking at it, is it art criticism? A lot of current art criticism doesn't criticize at all. Maybe it just informs. So what is it? Number 4, no one knows what the history of art criticism might be. Number 3, no one knows how to teach it. Number 2, it's everywhere. And before I show you number 1, I have to tell you a little story. The same art critic, Peter Plagans, that I mentioned, got in an argument with me about what I was writing, and he said, I should stop immediately because I'm just another example of an ivory tower academic trying to tell art critics what to do. And that we academics have ruined theater criticism and music criticism, and Peter Plagans said, you shouldn't be allowed to get your cold, clammy hands on us in art criticism because we are the last ones who are wild and free, and we can do what we want. We're not ruined by universities. And I said, fine, that's nice. What do you do? And he said, we write in a wild way. We do wild writing. And I said, that's nice, but what is wild writing? Right? So art criticism is wild, as Peter Plagans says, but what exactly is wild? Wild in relation to what? Right? Okay, on to the second part of the talk, which is various recent attempts. I'm going to talk about 2 recent attempts to figure out art criticism. First of all, the famous October Roundtable on Art Criticism. That's the parody of October, which you can get online. It's pretty funny. So the October Roundtable on Art Criticism was published 11 years ago. It's amazing to me. It included a number of people in the inner circle of October. There are their names. And I'm just going to make a few points about this. And I'm going to preface them by one screen about Rosalind Krauss's theory of criticism, because Rosalind Krauss's theory of criticism is what's behind the October Roundtable. So in 1985, she tried to reorient all of art criticism, and she had an idea which is still a very radical idea. I don't like promoting Rosalind Krauss, but this is a really interesting idea that is still not run its course. It's still in the air, this idea. So this is her idea. Criticism should expose, quote, those choices that precede and predetermine any act of judgment. So, sorry, I'm going to go back to that. So that means that if you're an art critic and you want to, you're in front of a sculpture and you think, I really like that sculpture, I'm going to write that it's a good sculpture. According to Rosalind Krauss, you should never say it's a good sculpture. According to Rosalind Krauss, you should say, what are the historical conditions that brought me to the point where I was about to say it's a good sculpture? You should never actually judge it, but criticism should be about the conditions of judgment, not judgment. So she calls that method. She says, in modernism, the point of criticism had to do with value and almost nothing to do with method. Criticism is now open to method. So according to Rosalind Krauss, the enterprise that she was engaged in, her kind of art history, is method. It's not criticism, it's not history in the normal senses, but it's something new called method, which is a reflection on the assumptions that make you want to judge. So criticism is therefore technically about the elucidation of judgment, not the performing of judgment. And that position remains very much entangled with what October does. So that's to preface it, and then I want to say a bit about the October Roundtable. That's David Jostlett. So 3 points about the October Roundtable. First, that the panelists don't even try to agree about whether or not art critics judge. David Jostlett says, criticism is about making a judgment. That's an anti-Rosalind Krauss idea. That's just an ordinary idea that criticism is about judgment. Then Helen Molesworth says, well, is judgment whether the art is good or bad, or is it judgment something like Donald Judd's criterion of interest? In other words, do we have to talk about judgment, or can we talk about interest? And then George Baker says that as an art historian or critic, he doesn't judge. He's interested in, quote, locating silences, articulating repressions, providing a space for certain types of work and certain artistic aspirations to continue and evolve. I consider this to be a very typical postmodern, post-structuralist evasion of the question of what art criticism actually is. This kind of answer, to me, doesn't make sense because it could go in the direction of judgment or away from judgment. It's not clear. So there's no further discussion of this, and that's what I want to emphasize. In the roundtable, these positions come up, and then no one thinks that it's important to worry about them. That's Hal Foster. Second point about the October criticism roundtable is that they don't try to agree about what art criticism does. So Hal Foster, in recent years, he's been doing some interesting work, basically observing other people. He's been a kind of a sociologist. So he's in this panel discussion 11 years ago, observing his colleagues, and he comes up with a theory. He says, we have 4 models of art criticism here. First model is archaeological, where the critic's business is to decide what counts as the object of criticism. Second, he calls exploratory, which he associates with George Baker. Maybe criticism is about exploring in the absence of judgment. Third is about paradigm marking. In other words, your job as a critic is to say, aha, postmodernism has arrived, and I'm the first one to say it. That's paradigm marking. And then fourth, maybe art criticism is mnemonic. Maybe it's about keeping ideas alive, reminding people what's interesting. So it's a reasonable and interesting thing that he does here. He has these 4 models, and they could go forward with it, but no one answers him. No one follows up on it. No one cares about the possibility that you could define art criticism in these ways. And that's what I want to stress. And third, anyone who works outside of academia and calls himself a critic gets very severely criticized in this. That's Peter Sheldall. Dave Hickey, the North American populist art critic, gets very severely critiqued. And I just want to read you this one because it's a fabulous example of Benjamin Buchloh being very black. But to Benjamin Buchloh, this populist critic Hickey is, quote, a rhapsodic substitute for art criticism. He seems to resuscitate art criticism, quote, by giving us something that has no social function, no discursive position, and that serves as a critical placebo. It's just, Buchloh is the blackest, darkest person who writes anywhere around art criticism. Okay, and I won't read that one, but so my moral in this last screen is just that the October people are very sure what they don't want, and that is they don't want journalism or anything that has any kind of popular reach to count as art criticism. But aside from that, in relation to the first 2 points, they have no idea exactly what they want. The roundtable is very defensive, the way October roundtables often are. Okay. So then my second, not the third, but the second example of an attempt to figure out art criticism is this book, which I co-edited, State of Art Criticism. I had a lot of people involved in it, and I'll just show you quickly the people who were in the book. Boris Groys was in it. Jean Fisher, one of the founders of Third Text, was there. Guy Brett, he's an English critic. Irit Rogoff, who does a lot of visual studies, she was there. Abigail Solomon Godot, one of the 1980s more interesting theorists and critics of photography, was there. Ariella Budik, she represented our populist because she writes for this publication which has 4 million readers. So she's a populist, a very busy art critic, writes to write every day. Steve Melville, he's a very interesting art historian who does deconstruction, and so he was there. Michael Newman, my co-editor, he does film theory. He works at Goldsmiths. Lynn Cook, the curator from the Dia Foundation. James Pinero, who is now going to be the editor of the New Criterion, which is the principal English language conservative art journal since the 70s. He looks conservative, too. And that's Dave Hickey, who I was quoting, the very populist North American critic. He's very anti-academic, Dave Hickey. And in fact, he wouldn't accept our invitation to come to this event when he heard who some of the other people were. And then I talked him into it. I said, it's okay. We're just going to talk. This is not a trap. And then he wrote to Michael Newman, my co-organizer, and he said, is Elkins trying to trap me? Is this an ambush? I said, no, you could just come and it's okay. It was okay. And then the book continues with about 50 other people. So I'm just give you this list. Andras Santo, do any of you know him? He's a Hungarian-born sociologist of art, works in New York City. Anyway, I'm just showing you these to show you that this was a big book. A lot of people are involved in this book. So it was very significant to me that the book did not come to any clear conclusions about art criticism. And I'm going to show you just 4 screens to demonstrate what I mean. So first of all, in relation to this question, what counts as art criticism? I'll give you the answers from the book on the bottom. Abigail Salomon Godot said, any writing that's self-reflexive or self-reflective and historically responsive is art criticism. In other words, a short piece in a newspaper is not art criticism because it doesn't have space to become self-reflective. Not enough room in the newspaper piece to become self-reflective. Therefore, it's not art criticism. Peter Plagens said, writing that responds honestly and personally to art and is wild. If it's wild, it's art criticism. If it's tame and domesticated, it's whatever, art history. I think anything that appears in an exhibition catalog or a brochure should be called art criticism. I have my own reasons for thinking that. But most of the people in the book didn't think it mattered. Most people didn't care what counted as art criticism in this book. Second question, does art criticism have a history? Dave Hickey says art criticism doesn't have a history. When we asked him who are his favorite art critics, he named some English authors he was reading, De Quincey, Hazlitt, and people. They're not art critics, but he wanted to say art criticism has no history. You just read the people you like in any field and you write like them. Michael Newman, my co-editor, says that art criticism does have a history, but it's not always pertinent. So, in other words, Baudelaire is part of the history of art criticism, but he's not connected to the present. I think art criticism does have a history, but it's a broken history. It's discontinuous. In several places, it has breaks in it. But most of the people in the book didn't care. For most of the people in the book, it didn't matter whether or not art criticism has a history. And this is what baffles me, that people don't care to make up their mind. Okay, third question. What happened to judgment in art criticism? James Pinero, he's the conservative editor of the New Criterion, he thinks that judgment was lost when post-structuralism came in. That's a typical conservative idea. He loves pre-Second World War art and moral art and art before gender and identity and politics and things like that. Ariel Budick says that judgment is an ornament or a luxury for a working art critic. She's the one who works for this massive circulation newspaper, so she has no time to judge. She thinks art criticism is about judgment, but she thinks if you're a working critic, you don't have time, it's a luxury. Rosalind Krauss, as I was saying, thinks that criticism has turned away from judgment to method. So that would be her answer. Boris Groys has this theory, as some of you know, about how judgment is no longer plus or minus, good or bad, but now Boris Groys says judgment is plus or zero. It's phenomenological. Either you're there or you're not. If you're there, you notice the work, you can write anything, doesn't matter, no one reads it. But if you're not there, you don't write, that's your zero. So, Boris Groys theory. Boris Groys is very perverse. But most of the people in the book don't care, didn't care. So this is my moral about this example and the October criticism, that the state of art criticism is very interesting and very strange, hard to understand. why most of the people in the field don't have a position on these subjects. I think this would be a little bit like if you talk to a bunch of physicists and they said something like, I don't know if E equals mc squared. I don't really have an opinion. Right? I've never thought about it. Right? I don't think it's possible. I think it's strange to not have that relation to the field. Okay, and the last of these, what's the relation between art criticism and art history? Abigail Solomon Godot says that art criticism is a source for art history, so future art historians will read what we write and it will turn into art history. Peter Plagans, as I said, thinks that art criticism is the avant-garde of art history, so we're out there in the trenches and it will become art history eventually. Rosalind Krauss thinks that art criticism informs art history, but on the other hand, history is critical. This is a position that I don't think anybody fully understands, the position of that October group. But most of the people in the book don't care. Okay. So I want to conclude from this part of the talk. According to most of the contributors to the state of art criticism, it doesn't matter what criticism is, provided it's interesting, but of course no one knows what interesting means. Okay, now I have about maybe 10 minutes left to start this third section. This is the section that I added last night to make some parallels with art history, and I don't think I'll be able to get all the way to the end of it, but I'll go 10 minutes into it. So one parallel between what's happening here or in art criticism or in this conference and art history and global art history is a concern with things like white space, black holes, center, periphery, and so on. These are discussed a lot in global and world art history studies, which is mostly what I do these days. So, for example, there's a group, Piotr Piotrowski and I are both contributors to this group called Artless. If you Google that, you'll see this is a group of mostly French art historians. They're based in Paris and the United States. And they have a big initiative to make a geographical revision of modernism and postmodernism. They have a geographical database. They have the places where modernists live on Montparnasse and so on. A lot of geographical information about addresses, and they have theories about geography and art. And they're producing a book, and I contributed the afterword to that book, and Piotr has a chapter in the book. So the whole idea of a horizontal art history and the idea of questions of center and periphery and margin and so on are very extensively discussed in the context of art history of modernism. So my own contribution to this is this book project I'm writing, tentatively called North Atlantic Art History and Worldwide Art, which I'm writing online. So in the background there is from my webpage. And on this next screen, what you're looking at here, this is on my website, but what you're looking at right here is the book itself, which I'm writing online. I'm writing it on Google Drive, and then the Google documents are live online. It's an experiment that I'm doing to try not to save writing until it's really nice and then put it out in public. But whenever I type it, it goes immediately onto the website with all the typos and everything. So there's a lot of information about center and periphery in relation to world art history on that site in relation to that book. But I want to talk about something else here. Sorry. So all of that I've been talking about has to do with content and theory. Theory of world art history, theory of globalization in art history, content, claims, and so on, the center, the margin. But there's another way of looking at both art history and art criticism that I wanted to introduce here because it seems to me equally or maybe even more important, and that is the question of form. So what I'm talking about here is the possibility that there are national or regional differences in the way that art criticism is written. Not the claims that are made, but the way that it's written. The style, the form, the voice, the manner, the habits, the narratives, all the different ways that art criticism is written. Because in art history, this is becoming more and more important to studies of global art history. Because people are interested in finding and preserving local, regional, national differences in the way that art history is written, in its methodologies, in its narratives, in its forms. So when you start looking at differences in style of art history, art historical writing, or style of art criticism, then it becomes very difficult to encounter unfamiliar practices and not consider them as partial, provincial, belated, or emerging. You see the parallel here between this and looking at visual art. If you look at visual art from a small center, a modernist center somewhere in the world, it's very hard sometimes not to see it as belated or provincial or inadequate. Same kind of thing with art historical writing. When I get essays written by people in places like Beijing, a graduate student sends me an essay, it's very difficult not to see that essay as possibly needing correction. It needs more sources, or it needs more theory, or it needs more awareness of criticism. And that's the same sort of issue. It's a question of trying not to see the unfamiliar practice as something that requires a raised level, requires improvement. So I'll give you some examples of this, not all 6 examples, but I'll give you some examples. So first of all, there's a distinction within art history between global and international art historians like Pyotr Piotrovsky, who are interested in writing for a whole international readership in art history. There's a difference between those and art historians who write for local consumption within their nation, within their region. And the best book on that is this one, edited by Matthew Brampley, principally. And it's a big book all about European practices of art history, and Matthew is interested in seeing the difference between a kind of art history that's written only to be read within its country, Romania, Estonian art historians only, whatever, and a kind of art history like Pyotr writes, which is meant to be read very widely. So the kind that's meant to be read within its nation could be called normal, in the sense of statistically normal, because most art history is still like that. And I think also this is true of art criticism. If you count exhibition catalogs and so on, most art criticism is local, regional, and national, and a smaller percentage of it is the international kind. So this is the subject of his book, and this is the way he says that. On the one hand, many journals have an international reach, yet these are far outnumbered by journals which are resolutely tied to the discussion of national art. This still remains a little explored aspect of contemporary art history. In art criticism, it's different, of course, because if you produce a book for a major exhibition, it is meant to be international. But I wonder if it's statistically that different. I wonder if there's still a lot of regional work, in other words. So the question is here, from the perspective of a global art history, if you're interested in worldwide practices, how do you read those local practices? Or, since we're talking about art criticism, from the perspective of a conference and an organization that's interested in international practices, how do you read a newspaper in, say, Paraguay, where you were last year, right? How do you read a newspaper critic there who's not intending to be read outside of that region? Can you read it as a sociocultural phenomenon, or do you have to read it, or do you have to try to read it as a part of the project of global art history, even though it's not intended that way? So this is a problem of how to understand and sympathize with and address kinds of practice that are not considering themselves to be international. Okay, second example is the Getty International Travel Grants that some of us know about, like Richard. So this is now in its 3rd year. It's run by these 2 people, and this is a program which gives money to people who can't travel to the North American Art History Association, the College Art Association. The idea is to reach out to places where art history is an emerging field, quote unquote. That's their literature. And this year, although I'm actually not supposed to say this, I'm legally obligated not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. This year, I'm the judge for this. This is supposed to be a secret, but the competition is over. So I got in some very interesting discussions with the people in this, and I'm not going to reveal anything that I'm not supposed to, obviously, about the individual applications in the process. But I've been very interested in the philosophy of the program. What is it that they want to accomplish? So in relation to the word emerging, and this is something that these people, Janet and Anne, are very interested in as well. So not saying anything that they're not already interested in. If you say that there are emerging practices, what are they emerging from? What are they emerging into? And what exactly is expansion? And if you're interested in making art history richer, what is richness? and what is diversity of discourse. All of this is directly applicable to art history as well. There are a number of, to art criticism, there's a number of initiatives within art history that are trying to increase the internationalism of art history, and I'm skeptical and curious about the philosophy of all of them. How can they avoid making a more homogeneous worldwide practice of art history? How can conferences like this, in the end, avoid making art criticism more homogeneous around the world? Because the more that the idea is enrichment and conversation, the more that comparisons are made, the harder it is for local practices to continue in the way that they have. Now, I have actually examples here that I'm going to have to omit. I have an example from Georgia, from Tbilisi, which I'd be happy to talk about, an example from Iran, where I was last year, and an example from China, where I've organized conferences for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm going to skip all of those, unfortunately, just so we have time for questions. But they're all case studies. I'm going to finish with just this, which is a third example of these kinds of initiatives. So this is the Clark Art Institute's Mellon Grant program, which I'm sure many of you know because they just finished a 3-year project to study art history in northeastern Europe. So on here are some of the people that were involved in it. And how many of you were involved in this? Anyone here involved in that? So they visited a number of different art history departments, mostly in the Baltics. And first they visited, well actually there's Almira right there. First they visited, and where are you, Almira? She's here somewhere. First they visited, and then they brought the people over to the Clark. So it was a very elaborate project, and at the moment they're beginning their second phase in Southeast Asia. So this also, for me, raises questions of knowledge transfer. What sorts of knowledge are gained by each side? I'm skeptical of this project because I know some of the people and places that they visited already, and I know some of the people and places that they're going to visit in Southeast Asia. And I'm aware of the fact that when they go to look at art history in these places, they're often meeting people who are already inclined to talk internationally, and they're missing the people who are less inclined to have those sorts of conversations. And I've heard from people who are not participating in their group about reasons why they don't want to participate, because it's, in the end, unclear about the ultimate goal. I like Michael Holly's, the one who runs it is she's a friend of mine, so is Keith Moxey, so I'm not saying anything directly about their intentions, but the overall aims of the program, I think, are unclear. They're first thought to be about getting information from quote-unquote peripheries and bringing it to a quote-unquote center, and then later they became a conversation. But the end result of that conversation still depends on concepts like richness and articulation of discourses, which I'm not entirely persuaded of. So it can appear as an unequal or at least an untheorized exchange. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop there. That's Tbilisi, and my next subject was going to be this, but I will end with this picture because when I was talking at the Clark with some people about this Mellon Grant program, my example for them was Tbilisi, because I had just been there in 2011, where there's an art history research institute, but they do a kind of art history that I don't think that the Clark would be interested in talking to them about, because it's so different from the kinds of art history that they would be used to or consider as interesting, that I think that the conversations would not have an easy way to get started. In other words, there are still practices of art history that are regional in specifiable ways, and those ways, it seems to me, should be studied and appreciated, and perhaps not brought into an international conversation in this kind of context. So it's a big, complicated subject, and I think I'll just stop there. Thanks.
I'm Dag Solhjell from Norway. I have read all your books on art critique. I have read all your books on art critique. Most of them are not mentioned here. I've not read the last one. I disagree with you on a very special point. You are saying, you commented it in your speech now, that catalog texts count as art critiques. They may be. I will tell you just very quickly about how my Art Critics Association in Norway take up new members. We accept only as members people who have written reviews of art exhibitions, professionally published, and they cannot show for them catalog text. They may have written them, they may be taught, they may be researched, but anything else does not count. So we have defined a certain type of critique occasioned by art exhibitions. And what I lack in your books, which are very elaborate, and I must give you very large credit for what you have done. That is, the word art exhibition does not come up. And if you go to the history of art criticism, then you go to texts that relate to art exhibitions. So to me, the most interesting part of the art critique is the one that relates to critically to art that is displayed publicly.
Thanks. Well, it's a very interesting subject, which I love to talk about. But I'll just say very, very quickly that the reason, you know this already, but the reason that I like to call those kinds of writing art criticism is just simply, very simply, because if you don't call a commercial gallery brochure art criticism, then it's not clear what kind of writing it is. There's that, and then there's the fact that the people are paid to write those, so people say, oh, well, that's not art criticism. But in my experience, most of the time, the people who write them actually want to make positive judgments. So the lack of negative judgments is not necessarily because the people were paid or the gallery would censor it, but very often because people are enthusiastic. But it's kind of quote-unquote uncritical enthusiasm doesn't tend to count. But you already know this from the book. So it's a practical thing. You're absolutely right about the exhibitions.
I have another question. My name is Molik from Germany. I have problems. We are talking about international art critic and international level of art critic. And after my experiences on this international level of art critic, I would say this international art critic is more or less based on a theory, and this theory was created on a couple of very elitist universities on East Coast. So it is not an international art critic, it is an art critic dominated by this US-American theory, based on critical theory coming from Germany.
That's exactly right, and that's why the book that I'm working on is called North Atlantic Art History. It's an inadequate term, but it's the best one I could find. But trying to find a way to name what counts as art history for many people in many different places, and trying to say that it actually comes from the North Atlantic, Central, Western Europe, East Coast, sometimes North Coast. Wait,
I know we are discussing in this kind of panels, but the problem is, and this is my experience, I write also for Art Forum, I write for Freeze, if you don't accept this way of thinking and this way of writing, you don't have a chance to be published.
Exactly.
And every time, if there is, as you say, an art critic coming from Beijing or somewhere else, and he is not accepting this way of thinking, they don't publish it, or they make correctors.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
So, and this is exactly what these people have to change in their thinking and their behaving. And these are exactly these people, like October people, who are talking about democracy, about acceptance, and they are not able to accept other point of view.
So, since this is such an important point, let me just take, it's such an important point, I want to take 1 minute out of the remaining, 3 minutes.
Juste un mot sur October.
Wait, just 1 second.
Sorry.
Sorry, it's a very, very important and central point, so I want to take one of my remaining 3 minutes to tell a little anecdote about this. So the reason I mentioned a Chinese student as my example is because last year I got an essay from a Chinese student who's in Beijing, and she wants to apply to a PhD program in Europe or in North America to study art history. This is on Roland Barthes and his influence in Chinese photography in the 1980s. Her essay cites the camera lucida, and her essay talks about the Chinese photographers in the 80s in China. But when I read this essay and think, would it be good to get her into a university PhD program or to get published in an art history journal, then I think, well, no, because she doesn't talk about the secondary sources of Roland Barthes, the whole literature, and she doesn't talk about when the artists in China knew and you know what they read. So the temptation is, if I were an editor, for example, to try to correct it. This is what I think people need to, in art history, need to think about. And my model for this, and this is probably not a great idea, but it's the best I can come up with, my model is world literature, world fiction. Because there, every local difference is exactly what people want. But in art history and in art criticism, often no. It's the North Atlantic model.
Okay, I have to watch who was first. So sorry for not giving everyone the microphone.
Well, I'm not going to take up any more time. I write for Huffington Post. You can read my criticism of your talk on the Huffington Post. How's that for you just absolutely ignored what the purpose of a critic and why criticism is totally falling into a black hole because of the cutback of the culture, which is, I'm sure, on the part of this hegemony that you inadvertently or somehow transparently revealed to us, to keep the new voices out of the culture. I mean, I was a newspaper critic. I mean, I was a subject of this kind of cutbacks in the culture. I mean, if it's not the critic that's alerting the academics to what's going on out there, how many academics are out there on the front lines, you know, at 10 o'clock in the morning, 7 a.m., 2 o'clock in the morning, looking at, you know, new performances on the Lower East Side? I mean, you know, it's like, if without that, there's no academic writing about art. And it's just like this was not even... You know, you came from this totally point of view of the Ivory Tower, which maybe was necessary, but we are an association of art critics. And, you know, thank you for...
Would you say that in parallel with the so-called lack of a canonical structure to criticism, that there's also a crisis in art history, given the complexities of this sort of pan-international project, and that what we're dealing with are problems of translation and language. AICA, I just mentioned this because our first volume dedicated to an international art critic will, I think, throw, as we say in English, the cat among the pigeons, because we're publishing a Paraguayan writer, Tiziano Escobar.
I know him, yeah.
And having been involved in the translation of that project...
not in that project,
no. No, I've been involved in the translation of that project with colleagues, and I think it will be an extremely interesting test case on addressing what art criticism is and whether that volume would qualify for that, because we're dealing with Latin American poetry, historical approaches, philosophy. It is a very interesting text, both in terms of an art historical approach and an art critical approach, and I would invite you to read it when you get hold of a copy.
I know him, and I agree that's a really great choice, and I can only say that I hope that it finds its public, because when this kind of thing is done in art history with the best of intentions, sometimes those kinds of texts end up in graduate seminars on, in this case, Paraguayan, culture. So it's a question of who ends up using it and reading it, but it's absolutely a great thing to do. And can I just say, I think it's also good to do, quote-unquote, the reverse. So, for example, the Terra Foundation, which does promotes American art, and mostly in Giverny, but around the world, the Terra Foundation is interested in translating American art history into Chinese. And I was speaking to their director last year and suggested to her that what they should do first is find Chinese art historians who are writing about American art, translate their books into English so they can see what the Chinese are doing before they decide which books the Chinese need. Yeah.
I'm Ed Rubin from New York, and I'm a curator, a writer. I just wanted to say that your paper or your presentation was a lot, and it went all over the place and seemed to cover a great deal. And as some of these papers that I'm seeing, it makes me say, I wish I was home writing, because it's driving me to study and write. But I did want to say that everybody's a critic. If all art, if anything and everything is art nowadays, then everyone is a critic. I did want to also say that Malraux, one of his interests is, he said, in all of this, he found it very interesting, and he did a spiral, how we became ourselves. The other thing is, this is all about philosophy. A great deal, I mean, you're a researcher and a writer, and you're putting things into a book. I also wanted to say one thing. I took notes in case I forgot. Wild writing is very exciting. And I write for a number of editors, and every editor has their idea. Like you said, when they teach you art criticism, they want you to write like them. If someone's teaching you. Well, one editor of mine says my paragraphs are too long. When I used to write for Art News, I was too subjective. On the one hand, I think everything is subjective one way or another. I also think that everything is what word did you use? I don't remember. But the one thing about wild writing, Hunter Thompson, the writer, is that his name? He wrote in a style that's called gonzo, and where he would have little short sentences or observations, and this to me is wild writing, and I think it's a very exciting way of writing, where anything could appear and anything can happen. So
I like Peter Plakins a lot. He wears cowboy boots, and he wears his baseball cap on backwards and his leather jacket, and
right.
I like the idea of wild writing. I'm just not sure I quite know what it is, but
right.
I like it in theory. Right. I think actually we're out of time, but I'm obviously lots and lots more to discuss, especially about whether or not I'm representing the ivory tower. But so I think I should stop now for the coffee break. So, thank you.